Good afternoon, everyone. This is Richard Eidlin with Business for America. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate your time and interest in voting by mail. What we wanted to do this hour was give you a quick update on what's happening at the federal level around voting by mail and how states are quickly responding to the COVID-19 crisis by adopting new systems that will allow them to have more citizens vote by mail. And with the current crisis, the real concern is people not having to sacrifice or pose a risk to themselves or their communities by going to a polling place in person. Thus, the idea of voting by mail, where you have the time to study your ballot and really come to a smart conclusion over a several week period of time, is gaining increasing attention from states. So today we have a stellar panel, and we wanted to give you the perspective of a number of secretaries of state, also the Vote at Home Institute, which has been working on this issue for a number of years, and finally from Patagonia, that has a complementary program called Time to Vote, wherein companies across the country will be encouraging their employees to go out and vote on November 3rd. So we want to make this as participatory as possible and take your questions. So let me just note that at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A little button there. And if you have a question, just type it in there and we will be posing those to the panelists as we go forward. Before we get going with presentations, I wanted to thank a number of organizations that were helpful in putting today's webinar together and that Business for America really appreciates. That includes New Hampshire Business for Social Responsibility, the North Carolina Business Council, and the Greater Seattle Business Association. And we have with us from the Greater Seattle Business Association, Matt Landers. And Matt, we asked him to just say a few words about why his organization believes that voting by mail is really important. So Matt, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you so much. I'm the Public Policy Government Relations Director at GSBA, Washington State's LGBTQ and Allied Chamber of Commerce. We're so excited to work with Business for America today, the panelists and the other partners to present this webinar. We in Washington State know that voting by mail is accountable, accessible, and safe. We're especially happy that our Secretary of State, Kim Wyman, is a panelist to show how our state does it well, the lessons we've learned, and how other states can learn from the West Coast states that have already figured this out as we can go forward. So thank you all for organizing this and for joining us today.
Great, good, Matt, thank you. We really appreciate your time. So let me now turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Bonk from Business for America. She's the founder of the organization. And we wanted to give you just a quick overview of the work that Business for America is doing. And then we'll move to hear from Amber McReynolds. So Bonk, why don't you go ahead? Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. And thanks to our panelists. Thanks to our co-hosts for helping to promote this. And thank you to everybody who's joining us online today. We have a number of folks from the business community, of course, some of our friends in the election reform grassroots community, and we also have a lot of state and local election officials who hope you'll get a lot out of this too and seeing what's possible for 2020. And I also want to thank everybody who's taking action to help out during this public health crisis. I saw today that my former employer, Apple, I was there nearly 15 years, and they're stepping up to help manage the supply chain for masks and also help with the design and production of a new face shield. So it's pretty remarkable what can be done when the business community gets in line with the interests of the public. So Business for America was founded on this idea. We believe that the interest of the public and the interest of the business community are aligned on having a well-functioning representative democracy. For businesses, they care about their employees, they care about their customers, they care about their communities. And so when you translate this to strengthening the health of our democracy, this means ensuring that our elections are secure and accurate and accessible. These things don't have to be at odds with one another. And it also means increasing choice in our elections with political competition and also reducing political polarization and toxicity. and helping to encourage bipartisanship and collaboration in advancing public policies that are good for all of us. So like everybody else out there, we've had to adjust in light of the coronavirus pandemic. And we have found our purpose to strengthen representative democracy is aligned with the need to protect public health in advocating to expand vote by mail for the 2020 elections. And to be clear, we're not calling to eliminate in-person voting entirely. In some places, it doesn't look like that is going to be feasible. What we are advocating is to expand vote by mail options as much as we can. And we're excited that this expert panel today is going to be able to help us understand what that will take, where the business community can help make a difference. And of course, this is going to vary a lot state by state. We've seen sort of the worst case scenario this week in Wisconsin, where public health and their primary election have become a game of political football between the left and right. And it's so frustrating to see where, you know, we have such a clear public interest and they can't seem to find common ground on common sense protections for public health and reducing the spread of the pandemic, and also having elections that the voters can trust are fair and accurate. And I want to contrast that with the work that we've done in Pennsylvania. And this proves it doesn't have to be that way. Last year, we supported, along with a number of grassroots organizations who are our partners, supported the passage of Act 27. This was an election modernization bill. It was very comprehensive and a huge step forward. It allows Pennsylvanians, among a lot of other things, to choose to vote by mail for any reason. So this bill was passed by a Republican legislature, and it was passed in a bipartisan fashion, and it was signed by a Democratic governor. So this proves we can cross party lines and pass the vital legislation to make elections both more secure and more accessible. So between public health and the economy, it looks like we're going to be in for a rough ride for a while. And as each of us are asking ourselves what we can do, we're asking, can we leave democracy better off as a result of these next few months? Vote by mail is a big part of how we can do that. And the business community can make a big difference by helping to pass bipartisan divides and get things done. Business for America, we have a letter to Congress and state lawmakers asking to fund the expansion of vote by mail for the 2020 elections. And we're going to be continuing our advocacy to help make that happen as much as possible. So visit bfa.us to find out more. And again, thanks for joining us. Richard, I'll hand it back to you.
Good, thank you. And again, I really wanted to reiterate the primary objective of Business for America is to mobilize the businesses, small, mid, and large-sized companies in pursuit of strengthening our democracy. And there are many important roles that businesses can play over the next 6-7 months to encourage wide-scale participation in the election. So let me now turn to our first panelist, Amber McReynolds, and we're really happy to have Amber with us today. She's the founder and the executive director of the National Vote at Home Institute, which is based in Denver, Colorado. And Amber has been working on a number of important vote by mail or vote at home initiatives. And Amber, if you could give us an update on what is happening across the country, maybe give us some insight into the monies that were provided or that will be provided by the federal government to help states, and what businesses might be able to do to help move this trend along at the state level.
Sure. Well, thanks to Richard and Sarah for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm always lucky and feel honored to be on a panel with two of my favorite secretaries of state, and two secretaries of state that are leading in terms of this particular reform, but also leading efforts to prepare not only their states, but help other states prepare for this for this upcoming election cycle. I'm going to share my screen really quick here. I do have a couple slides to share, and I've been talking about this as a desire and a need to deliver democracy. And it's sort of, kind of a play on the fact that a lot of voters are opting in to request their ballots by mail, but really with this idea of expanding voting at home options because of not only the emergency we're facing, but what we've been talking about for many years now, which is that this provides a more convenient and accessible option for voters to vote. And we've certainly seen that the success of this type of model in Western states. And what I would say, and I think with Wisconsin, which was already mentioned as a background, the time to act is now, and we need to ensure every voter can access the voting process in a safe way, as well as a secure and an accessible way. And a lot of sort of folks that think that November is a long ways away, it's not. And state and local election officials need an ability to act and make decisions now to purchase equipment and scale up. So decisive action and immediacy amongst political leaders within a state is really important. And it also, as Sarah mentioned, it is not a partisan issue. It's an issue of all voters being able to access their democracy and choose their elected leaders in a safe and secure way. The challenges are massive, and this unprecedented crisis requires extraordinary creativity, just like we're seeing in the business community and various businesses stepping up to provide ventilators and masks and other supplies. It's similar with the voting process in that there is going to be a reliance on vendors and infrastructure and voting outreach and all of that, and it is going to take a community effort. A couple of the challenges is again ensuring every voter can vote, but this avoidance of public spaces and crowds, adjusting election administration in a very fast way, the timing of everything, political will, and then of course the significant reduction in human capital and poll workers that are required. We're seeing that play out in front of us, not only in Wisconsin but in other states as well. Our organization is unique. In addition to being the CEO of National Vote at Home, I ran elections for 14 years in Denver. I was one of the designers of what's kind of been called the Colorado voting process, but it includes mailing a ballot to every elector. We followed Utah and Washington in that effort, and we added to it, including vote centers, preserving in-person options at voting centers, same-day registration, and then also implementing effective audits post-election. And it's worked extremely well in Colorado and all the Western states that have done this, but it gives National Vote at Home Institute a unique position in that not only can we help with governors and advising political leadership and policymakers, but we can also lead and help election officials as they plan for and scale up these options. Wanted to provide a map of the country. We sort of have a five-point rating system, if you will, for where states are. And you can see that it's it's very diverse in terms of how these types of policies are implemented right now. Wisconsin, given that it's top of mind, is a state that's considered step 3, meaning a voter can request a ballot. But what we've seen play out in Wisconsin is something that I think all election officials in all states, especially in the step 3, step 2, and step 1 states, is that there's been a significant increase of voters asking to vote at home. They went from 120,000 applications 2.5 weeks ago to 1.4 million a few days ago. And what that means is all of those election officials had to process all of those requests and do all of that data entry in a very short period of time, which has created a lot of significant issues there. So simply offering the option to request a ballot comes with its own challenges when a state may not be prepared to accept that volume. And in a lot of ways, it's actually easier to do what a state like Washington does or what a state like California does on a mass scale, to mail out a ballot automatically so that you avoid all of that extra data entry that we just saw have to happen in Wisconsin. And just to give a kind of a quick diagnosis, the current voting process is inherently flawed, and what this pandemic has exposed is the significant vulnerabilities with the reliance, or the significant reliance that many states have on the in-person voting structure, meaning assigned polling places with very little vote by mail or very little early voting. It's also exposed that our election officials and the infrastructure associated with it is not adequately prepared right now with the resources they need hence the federal funding aspect of this, which is critical. Decision making has been paralyzed, and election officials have very little authority on their own to act. So they're reliant on other political leaders to get some of these decisions moving, and then inconsistent applications of laws. And all of this leads to the problems that we're seeing play out in Wisconsin right now with voters and election officials and really anyone that touches the process having a very difficult time in dealing with it. I wanted to skip quickly to this turnout allocation. And so this was as of March 17th. All of the green bars that you see here are states that have predominantly mailed out ballot models where they have in-person voting, but they predominantly mail a ballot to all voters. You can see on here, Washington leads the country, even though they were in the middle of dealing with the pandemic on March 10th. And a state like Illinois actually saw a 25% reduction in early voting or in turnout for their March 17th primary, primarily because they have very little vote at home options and very little voting at home. So I think this recent example indicates that states like California, Washington, Colorado they're very much resilient because they have these expanded options. And we have to look at this very closely as we go into November to make sure states are prepared, because there are clearly models that work well. We've put out a strategy plan on how to actually scale this in an appropriate way. It's available on our website, and we can follow up and share that link after this election. But the idea is really thinking about it in terms of scaling a massive operation and a massive system in states that aren't like California or Colorado or Washington, thinking about it in a completely different way than maybe they've thought about it before. And we lay out basically two options to scale, one being more localized and another being more centralized or regionalized for states that don't have a lot of vote by mail right now. And so a couple of, and we can share this later, but we do have a couple of resources that I'm happy to share with the group. And again, just appreciate being here, look forward to the conversation, and look forward to answering questions as we go forward. Thanks so much.
Great. Good. Amber, thank you so much. And thank those of you who are submitting questions. Amber, let me ask you a quick question. Give us some perspective on what the $400 million in the COVID stimulus in the CARES Act is to be used for. And do you anticipate quickly again that there will be more federal funding coming to states to help them adopt these kinds of changes?
Sure. The federal funding, first off, the $400 million is not enough. And it doesn't come with any guardrails or suggestions for how states use it. So it's really up to states in terms of how they use the funds. And, you know, when you have great secretaries of state, like the two that we have on our webinar today, you know, they will obviously use it to make sure their election officials are ready and scale up. If you have secretaries that maybe don't think vote by mail or voting at home options are the right way, then those resources might be used differently. So it's going to vary by state. I think that there's also some debate going on right now on whether or not it should be matched. So the intent of the legislative body and Speaker Pelosi and others, even in a bipartisan way, they intended to allocate the $400 million so states could do that, not requiring a match. And there's now been an interpretation that there's a match requirement. So there's sort of some debate now on making sure that states don't have to come up with that match so that they can still get their funding. But that's essentially what exists right now. My hope is there's going to be more funding coming, but I think that's going to continue to be a discussion. We need to ensure there's bipartisan support on that.
Right, good. And let me just remind everyone that Business for America has initiated and is now circulating a letter calling on Congress to, in fact, provide that $2 billion, which, as Amber indicated, is what's necessary in order to enable more states to take action. And that letter can be found on our website. And we really encourage all business leaders and companies to sign on to that. We're going to come back to ask Amber some more questions here that the listeners are continuing to send in, so it's great. But let me now turn to Alex Padilla, who's the Secretary of State in California. And California, as many of you know, has sort of a vote by mail system that is emerging. It's not a statewide system. Certain municipalities and counties have adopted it, but I know that Alex is moving actively to try to broaden that so that everyone in the great state of California has an opportunity. So Alex, please tell us, if you would, what's happening in California and what initiatives are being undertaken there.
First and foremost, I know others have said it already, but I pray that everybody watching, everybody listening is staying safe and healthy during this unprecedented crisis. I know a lot of folks are worried out there, but if we all do what we need to do, stay at home to the extent possible, we'll hopefully get to that flattening of the curve and the backside of this pandemic sooner rather than later. So I want to just make sure to let everybody know we're thinking about each and every person in California and throughout the country and frankly around the world. The other thing that I'd like to share, just to put this conversation in context, is what's at stake. While there's a lot of public health concern and dialogue going on because of the pandemic, let's not let our democracy be a casualty of what we're all living through in real time. I'd like to think that you can turn the news on right now, watch the lines and the people of Wisconsin and say, that's exhibit A as to what we need to avoid in November. This is avoidable. But it's not exhibit A, it's actually exhibit B, because just a couple of weeks ago, Ohio on election eve was having this close to, crisis on what election day was going to look like for the people of Ohio. We can't afford this disorganization. We cannot afford the chaos and the uncertainty for voters if we're going to maintain the resiliency of our democracy. And if we look back at our nation's history, it should be comforting to know that Americans have always gone to the polls on election day in times of peace, in times of war, in good economic times, in economic recessions, including the Great Depression. And even during the flu pandemic of 1918, we found a way to overcome. And so as we look at this November's general election, for example, it's not a matter of if, it's not even a matter of when we will conduct the election, because we have a date, Tuesday, November 3rd. The question is how. For folks wondering, well, do we preserve public health or do we uphold the right to vote? It is not an either or option. There is a way to maintain our accessible, secure elections in a way that's safe for everybody, for voters, for poll workers and election staff and everybody in between. And a big pillar of that is vote by mail or vote at home. So yes, to Amber's point, every state is in a slightly different position when it comes to experience with vote by mail. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't be working aggressively to afford every voter in America that option. Look, President Trump himself has requested a vote by mail ballot for the upcoming primary in Florida. And if it's good enough for Trump, it's good enough for every voter in America. You shouldn't have to run an obstacle course to be able to exercise your right to vote when, where, and how you prefer. That's been the philosophy in California, and it turns out that a lot of the policies that we've been championing in recent years to maximize access to the ballots make even more sense during this public health pandemic. And so again, at the core of that is vote at home, vote by mail. But even before then, when it comes to voter registration, California is one of the states that offers online voter registration. You can still look for that postcard, mail it in if you'd like, or wait till you visit the Department of Motor Vehicles if you'd like, but you can do so online, and there's no safer way to do it in this time period than that. We're also proponents of not just vote by mail only, but preserving, to the extent feasible, the in-person option for voters who prefer it, for voters who need assistance, or need to participate in same-day registration. But even when and how we do that has to be in a way that's safe and protects everybody's health. But vote at home is the core here. And there's a couple of distinctions that I think are important to highlight. Number one, when people talk about universal vote by mail, I think too quickly people assume erroneously that we're talking about all vote by mail only, right? As I already mentioned a minute ago, it's important to maintain the in-person option. But how do we keep people healthy when they're voting in person? More people voting by mail, more people voting early reduces crowds and lines on election day, so everybody is healthier as a result. The other thing is to recognize that the ballot has to move in two directions, from the county to the voter, and then from the voter back to the county. So what we've called for is every voter receiving a ballot in the mail automatically, and you give voters the option for how they choose to return that ballot. By mail is frankly what most people choose, but if they want to deliver it to a secure drop box or to a vote center or polling location, because that's what they prefer, we can afford to do that as well. So what we've been expanding in California has been sort of a progression of policies. Years ago, we went from the excuse vote by mail to no excuse vote by mail to now voters can sign up to be permanent vote by mail voters. And that continues to grow in popularity. But in more recent years, inspired by the work that Amber did in the city and county of Denver, we offered that model, that Colorado model, to voters in California in a proposal known as the Voters' Choice Act. Given the nuances of legislation in California, it is not a statewide mandate, but frankly, an option for voters with incentives built in, for counties, option for counties with incentives built in. Of the 58 counties in California, 5 counties made the transition to this newer model. Everybody gets the ballot in the mail with options for how to return it. Wildly successful, even in a record turnout midterm election. In 2020, we now have 15 of our 58 counties working under the Voters' Choice Act model, but this includes some of the biggest counties in California and in America, counties like Los Angeles, Orange County, Santa Clara, and others. So more than half the state's voters in California now have this Voters' Choice Act benefit. So if you lump the Voters' Choice Act counties, where everybody gets their ballot in the mail automatically, with the voters who choose to receive their ballot by mail, either for that particular election or permanently, more than 75% of voters in California received a vote by mail ballot in the primary. And again, the graph will just continue to go up. But given the stakes that are before us and the world that we're living in from a health perspective, I like to see it 100% of voters receive their ballot in the mail this November. We know we can do it. We must do it. Maintain our democracy and preserve the health of our citizens.
Secretary Padilla, thank you so much. And let me ask you a question that several people have posed here, which is about the potentiality for fraud and abuse with a vote by mail system. So is there any merit to that? Is that something that you're concerned about in California?
Look, of course, it's something that we ask ourselves, and we take the potential and even allegations of fraud seriously, but we need to keep it in perspective, right? Far too often across the country, the voter fraud concern is simply used as pretext to make it harder for eligible citizens to register to vote or for eligible voters to be able to cast their ballots. So, we need to make our policy decisions based on data and fact and experience. And here's how vote by mail has worked. When somebody is voting by mail, they get their ballot, they fill it out at their convenience, and when they put it into that return envelope, you have to sign the back of that envelope. And that signature is what counties use to measure against the signature on file to make sure that the person returning that ballot is indeed the registered voter. And if the signatures do not match, depending on the state, either the ballot's not counted, or in a state like California, the county will attempt to contact that voter to address any signature mismatch issues. So there's a lot of protocols and procedures in place to prevent against either double voting or other types of voter fraud. It is a genuine, question, but security measures that have been in place, not just in California. Frankly, there are national standards and best practices across the country. I'll mention just one other one quickly. Some people say, well, what if I request a vote by mail ballots and then I return it, but then I go into the polling place and try to cast another ballot? You know, how do we protect against things like that? The good news is counties are able to register the first ballot back from a specific voter. And so let's say I voted on election day provisionally or otherwise, and then my vote by mail ballot reaches the county is going to know that I already voted in person. And so the vote by mail ballot will not be counted, or vice versa. If the vote by mail ballot is returned and I try to go vote, I will not be allowed because my vote record will have that denoted. So again, just a couple of examples of a lot of protocols and protections in place against voter fraud.
Great, great, thank you. And I'll just report a comment that Ricardo Iberia notes that he says in Florida, the ballot envelope asks for cell phones and email of the voter so they can be contacted quickly in the event of a signature mismatch. So that sounds like an additional precaution. Good, good. Alex, thank you. We'll come back to you here in a moment, but let me now turn to another state on the West Coast, Kim Wyman, the Secretary of State for Washington State. And Kim, I know you have led a very successful program over, I believe it was 5 years, of initiating a complete vote by mail system in Washington. And tell us how that has been working, and also your sense of what else the federal government can be doing to support more states adopting programs like you have in Washington.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you, Richard, for having me on today, and good to see you, Secretary Padilla. Yeah, we're over here on the West Coast trying to keep it all together. But I first want to thank this whole Business for America effort to try to partner with the elections community to ensure that our democracy moves forward and isn't paralyzed by the COVID-19 pandemic and the effect it's having on election offices across the country and voters across the country. So I want to kind of start with just doing the frame of, from my perspective, of how this disease and this pandemic are really touching every aspect of every type of election system. I know that the country kind of looked over to the left coast, as many people call it, and said, hey, you know, what are y'all doing over there with vote by mail? We should move it dramatically across the country. And I would say that it's a heavy lift, and we're all going to be impacted by the COVID-19 impact. First and foremost, giving the business community the perspective of how elections are conducted across the country. First of all, we have about 10,000 election officials like Secretary Padilla and I at the state and county level who conduct elections. They're either appointed or elected. And these are a wide variety of jurisdictions. We have, you know, jurisdictions as big as LA County with 5.5 million registered voters, down to local jurisdictions that have a few hundred. And so it's a wide disbursement of authority and how we conduct elections, and additionally how those elections are carried out, from complete in-person experiences to complete vote by mail experiences. So when we start there, and I'll start by looking at Washington, because I think there are a lot of lessons learned that through our state's experience that are really applicable, but we also have to realize that it took time, which is something we really don't have a lot of this year. Even as November seems very far off from an election perspective, it's very close. So first and foremost, Washington State really started our move to vote by mail in 1993. Our state passed motor voter before the federal law was passed. We started allowing counties to do certain elections by mail, and we allowed any voter to be a permanent absentee voter. So by 1996-97, we had some counties like mine, I was a county official first, we had 60% of our voters who were choosing to vote by mail every election. And what that really translated into in small elections is 10% of our ballots were being cast at the polls. 90% were being cast by mail. And that all came to a head in 2004 when we had the closest governor's race in the country's history. 2.8 million ballots cast, and we had 2 recounts and a court case, and Governor Gregoire won by 133 votes. And what that experience really taught us was when you are at the 60% mark, you are really a vote by mail state, you just don't know it yet. I've said that a lot lately. And what I mean by that is when you have that many people who are getting an absentee ballot every election, you're having to do 2 elections, set up a complete poll site election and a complete vote by mail election. And again, I'm sure that California and Secretary Padilla know it firsthand because that's the world that they're living in. And you can't be successful. And that's what we found. We had a lot of problems. I know people will point to vote by mail as being fraudulent and having problems. I can tell you from that experience, a lot of the problems we had of double voting and provisional ballots being counted that shouldn't have been occurred at the polling places. So this idea that polling places are free of any kind of problems is just not true. They all have their challenges, and our job as election officials is to balance security and access. And how do we make sure that those stay in balance through whatever decisions we make from a policy standpoint? 2005, our legislature allowed us to move by county, like California, to vote by mail. And most of our counties did move in that first year. But it took 5 years for our larger counties to completely go over to vote by mail because we needed to build up the capacity to process the volume. And I think that that's going to be the hardest thing to overcome in this election cycle is how do we build out that capacity for these local jurisdictions or states to be able to deal with the incredible increase that we anticipate of even absentee ballots. I think Amber did a great job of really framing some of those challenges across the country, but the cold hard reality is COVID is affecting 16% of our population out of the gate as the highest risk group, people who are over 60 years old. And so that's going to affect our voters who are older, and it's going to affect our poll workers, our vote center workers, and it's going to affect our people processing ballots, getting those vote by mail or absentee ballots mailed out. So out of the gate, I think as we've been starting to think of how the business community and the election community can start partnering, I think there's some really great action items that could happen. The first and foremost is we need to do an inventory. And I know that Vote at Home Institute and Amber have been working really hard on trying to identify what resources we have and need. So how can a state really increase their vote by mail production? And even states, like some of our southern states that have 5% turnout rates for absentee ballots, they're not going to be able to go to vote by mail. It's just physically, I don't think in the timeline possible. However, they've got to build in the capacity for that 16% of people that are going to have to vote at home because they can't go into a polling place. So how do we do that? How do we reach that? The first thing is that inventory of what states are going to need to process, maybe a 20, 30, 40% jump in absentee ballots. What's the throughput that they need? How are they going to make it efficient? How are they going to get things, the ballots through, not only on the mail out side, but on the back end? What are the timelines that are in legislation? How long do you have to certify the election? I know that some states certify, in my opinion, remarkably quickly. And if you only have a 5-day window to deal with millions of ballots, you're probably not going to be able to get them processed and counted and certified in time. So, we need to look at that from the election side of the house. How many ballots do you need? Do you anticipate having to run through your sorters? How long is it going to take you in your current environment, or if you had more equipment? And then finally, in terms of the business partnership, I think there's a couple of areas where we really can partner. The first one is once we identify that we need, say, 100 high-speed envelope sorters nationwide that we can put on the ground in states or in local jurisdictions. How many are actually in the supply chain right now? How many are available? How many need to be produced? Same for supplies and materials, the PPE that we need for our voters and for our election workers. All of that, I think, are just measurable metrics that we can partner with the business community and say, this is what needs to be spun up. When you look at what Ford and Ferrari have done in the last couple of weeks of completely retooling their production facilities to make ventilators, how exciting is that initiative that we see across the country in business, partnering with what are those needs in the election community and how can we meet those needs? How can we have enough hand sanitizer, at a polling place, in every polling place or every location or every, for that matter, election office that does same day registration? How can we get enough of those hand sanitizers so that those election workers and voters can be safe? not to mention masks and all of the other equipment we're going to need. And finally, I am most concerned about the personnel and workforce needs that we have. When you look at that impact of the 16%, I can tell you from experience is that the majority of our poll workers and our election workers that are the seasonal workforces that do provide this work, they're over 60. They're mostly retired people. And we're going to see between half and 2/3 of our workforce not available for this election. So we're going to have to just backfill that out of the gate. Right now, as we sit here today, we're going to have to figure out where we're going to get that workforce. And then we're going to need probably that same number of backup workers on election day and during the voting period, because people are going to get sick. They're going to get exposed to COVID-19. They're going to be quarantined for 2 weeks. Centers are going to get closed down potentially because they're going to need to be cleaned. I think that the partnership with the business community is building out the equipment. I forgot to mention also facilities, space. Election facilities are going to need to be greatly increased in terms of space for customer service and ballot processing, let alone polling places. So I think we have some real opportunities to partner the two communities and really get through this together. And we have to make sure our democracy continues no matter what the impacts of COVID-19 are. So thank you so much for putting this together.
Good. You're welcome. Thank you, Kim.
If I can chime in just
Please.
for a minute here.
Yeah.
I think Kim did a fabulous job laying all that out, and everything she said applies to California, absolutely. But to her final point about partnering with the business community, it is on getting the word out and recruiting the next generation of poll workers, not just in the years ahead, but for this November. And in many states, there are upcoming primaries that have been delayed from recent weeks or a week or two ahead to the coming months. So that's one big one. And two, the location or the siting of polling places and vote centers. If you think of nothing else, a lot of polling places historically, maybe in retirement homes or senior centers, that's the last place we ought to be now. And so where are we going to site the new ones without disenfranchising a lot of seniors and retirees? But also just the square footage, for example, that's necessary. If you had an old voting location, let's say with 40 voting booths, we can't place them side by side anymore. We got to space them out. So, maybe there was a location with 1,000 square feet that was sufficient before. Now you're looking at 2,500 square feet or more, right? So a lot of these logistical challenges that state by state we're dealing with, let alone county by county and local jurisdiction by local jurisdiction.
And
Right.
if I could add on that too, one of the other considerations, and we've been talking to a lot of states about this, is, what with Washington and what California has, they mail out a ballot to everyone, and California almost all the way there, but most voters in California are getting a ballot mailed to them. And what's great when you have a system where you're automatically doing that is that actually alleviates a ton of stress off of the in-person voting structure. So in a lot of ways, it's not 100% vote by mail, like what a lot of people make the mistake of saying. It's 100% mail ballot delivery to every voter who's registered, while still preserving this in-person structure that is not as stressed anymore, because you've essentially dealt with 90-some% of your customers before election day because they got a ballot in their hand. And so in a lot of ways, it's looking at it as an alleviator of stress, whether it's because of poll worker shortages, because of locations changing, because of space not being available anymore. It alleviates the stress and kind of becomes a backup, if you will, or a contingency, which is why Washington and California and a lot of the Western states that have this are more resilient right now than the states that haven't had this in place.
And Amber, as you know, California covers the return postage, right? So the return envelope for your ballot has postage prepaid. So scrambling for a stamp is not an issue, or people feel like they have to walk it in because they don't have stamps. It further alleviates that stress that you mentioned.
Right. Yeah, and that's a great point. It'd be wonderful if each state pursued that. Let me pick up on this theme of the role of business and turn to our final panelist, which is J.J. Huggins from Patagonia. And Patagonia, PayPal, and Levi Strauss developed a program in 2018 called Time to Vote, which is now carrying on into 2020, which encourages companies of all sizes across the country to provide their employees with time off to vote. So Business for America and is discussing with Time to Vote and discussing with Amber how we can in fact do what Kim and Alex both suggested, which is mobilize the business community around this urgent need. So JJ, let me turn it over to you. Tell us a bit about Time to Vote and what the intersection could be with companies helping not only get people to the polls, but possibly have workers show up and provide the support that Kim indicated is going to be needed.
Sure. Thank you all for having us here. It's an honor to be on this panel and honor to be a part of this conversation, given everything, especially everything that's happening in the world right now. Time to Vote was created pre-pandemic. The origins go back to really 2016 when Patagonia decided to close all of its stores and all of its offices around the US and give all of our employees election day off. So we closed down for election day. We gave everyone the day off that year for the general election. And we sent a statement to our employees. We sent a signal to them, to our workforce, saying, look, nothing is more important on election day than voting. Simultaneously, we were sending that signal to our customers as well. And our CEO, Rose Marcario, she really enjoyed getting all the feedback afterwards from our employees. Think of people who work in retail stores and maybe they're living paycheck to paycheck. They could be a single parent, and on a normal election year, it's really difficult for them to, especially if they live in a state that doesn't have mail-in voting, it's really difficult for them to find the time on election day to hit the polls. And they felt like their company really cared for them and cared for their rights as an American to cast their ballot and have their voice be heard in the election that year. In 2018, Patagonia decided that we wanted to try to scale this little program we had and bring it outside of Patagonia's walls and scale that out to the rest of the business community. And that was the year that gave birth to Time to Vote. We started Time to Vote by talking to a few companies where we had friends, primarily Levi's and PayPal, and we asked them to join us in creating this movement where the business community would provide literally time for their employees to either get to the polls or time to learn their ballot and fill out their ballot if they're in a mail-in voting state. We figured we might get a couple dozen companies in 2018, and we got 411 that year. And it generated a lot of media buzz, which was exciting, and it generated this positive momentum. And we decided to keep it going. For 2020, we have so far 457 companies enrolled in Time to Vote. The plan is to get 1,000 companies enrolled. And like I said in the beginning, this all was happening pre-pandemic. And now we're finding ourselves in this unprecedented territory, like all of you, where on one hand, we have a lot of the companies who are joined in Time to Vote are currently laying off their workers or they're furloughing people, and they're in a whole other crisis mode right now. And then on the other hand, we can't, like Alex said earlier, we can't let our democracy be another casualty of this pandemic. And so what can we do? So speaking for Patagonia specifically, we're really excited about the prospect of having our employees potentially volunteer as poll workers. They could help in the physical spaces. They can help count ballots. We're going to begin exploring that internally to see what we can do there. And then we want to talk to the rest of the Time to Vote community in the next couple of weeks and see what kind of appetite there is out there from our member companies, and see how many people we have, just like both the Secretaries of States were just talking about, how many people from the American workforce can we get out there to help you all and to help other Secretaries of State with this mission. So we're exploring all that internally right now. We're still trying to get 1,000 companies enrolled. If you are listening to this and you work at a company and you think the leadership of your company might be interested in joining Time to Vote, please visit maketimetovote.org. I think a lot of the smaller companies out there right now might have an easier time joining this movement. Time to Vote does involve a lot of big American companies, and those are some of the companies that are feeling the most drastic effects of this pandemic right now and of the economy. And maybe there's an opportunity here for us to get more of the small business community to join us. And then keep an eye on our website, and we'll be happy to share out some communication once we work with you all here on this panel to kind of formalize what we can do to help. We're excited about getting involved.
Great, good. JJ, thanks a lot for that. I wanted to, JJ, if you could tell us sort of about, Patagonia is known as a progressive company, but not all companies in the Time to Vote movement are oriented the way you folks are. So tell us just a little bit about the sort of the nonpartisan, bipartisan nature of Time to Vote and how that might apply to recruiting workers to participate in running the election on November 3rd.
Patagonia we speak out a lot on environmental issues, which to us, we feel that the environment is a nonpartisan issue. We actually work with a lot of groups like hunting and fishing groups where the membership are probably, a lot of them are Republicans. And we feel that environmental causes, protecting public lands, mitigating the climate crisis is a nonpartisan issue. But that's what got us interested in voting, in civic engagement to begin with. We feel like the most important thing we can do to protect what we love on this planet is to vote and to elect leaders who are going to represent all of us in America and globally. Put all that to the side. Once we scaled Time to Vote and turned it into a national movement, we made the very conscious decision to ensure that it is nonpartisan, and we reached out to companies where we knew the workforce would represent people with different beliefs than the people who work for Patagonia or the people who work for Levi's. One of the first companies we recruited was Walmart, and they're still a member. Target is a member, Best Buy is a member, JP Morgan Chase is a member. We have really tried to go outside of our bubble to recruit companies where the CEOs of those individual companies, they might have their political beliefs that are somewhat partisan, but if you think of the workforce of a company like Walmart and all the people who are working those cash registers right now, those people, that's going to be the broadest, most diverse range of political opinions you could find in America if you took all those workers and put them in one room. And we've made a very conscious effort to reach out to all types of people.
Great, thank you. A number of folks have written in with similar questions. So this is for any of the speakers. And the question is oriented around the claim that vote by mail is a partisan initiative, that it's intended to elect Democrats. And so I wonder if any of the speakers have a perspective on that. Kim, I see, is raising her hand. I will note that Secretary Wyman is a Republican, Secretary Padilla is a Democrat. So maybe that's an indication right there that there's nothing here about partisanship. But Kim, why don't you go ahead?
Well, a couple of things that just ran through my mind as JJ was talking. I think that this is the beauty of this idea that you've started, is that we can bring together not only the election community, which arguably should be nonpartisan, even if we're elected as partisans, the business community, and quite frankly, the nonprofit and maybe the activist community, however you want to classify that, together, because I think we can all agree that our democracy is really what is at stake here and what is the heart of America. So I think this opportunity is to approach this in a bipartisan way. And I say that as a Republican statewide elected in a very blue state. It has to transcend it. And in fact, I'm spending a bit of time right now working with my Republican counterparts to get them to open up to kind of the rhetoric that I think both sides have always had, and we, I think Alex this might be something he and I could agree on, that I think historically that the left is very concerned with voter suppression and the right is very concerned with voter fraud, and both sides politically certainly use that to rile up their base at times, or to make points or make policy decisions, for God's sake, that are unfortunately sometimes driven to either help my team or hurt your team. And we have to get past that in this crisis. We cannot continue as business as usual with partisan rhetoric or how we approach the solution. It has to be bipartisan, and we're already seeing it. You can see what happened as soon as we sent out a letter from the Secretaries of State in a bipartisan manner. Immediately both sides jumped. And I can tell you how the Republicans reacted, and I can tell you how the Democrats reacted, and we got to get past that. And I think the only way that's going to happen is that if Secretaries of State like Alex and I talk to our respective teams and figure out how we can find common ground to move this forward, because every state is affected by this pandemic. And and kind of closing my little rant here, one of the things that the Ohio Secretary of State, I have to give him full credit for this, had an idea a while ago to have a selective service. Having something again, partnering with all of these communities from nonprofit sector to the business sector, to try to find that workforce that we're going to need. I forgot to mention, not only we're going to need to backfill these people that are leaving, we're going to have a reserve force in place for people that get exposed or have to leave, or whatever. So I just think we have some really great opportunities here, and let's figure out a way to really talk about them in a bipartisan way.
Great.
Yep, I agree. When I give a lot of my presentations and talks, I remind folks, what were we all taught in high school government class, right? That our democracy works best when as many eligible people get a chance to participate. So yes, there are ways to keep voter registration secure, but we can improve on accessibility. And same thing with casting your ballots. It's imperative that we maintain the security and integrity of our elections, but there's a lot more that we can and should be doing nationally to increase access to the ballot. This should not be partisan, and we have the policies that have been demonstrated to work, including vote by mail. No excuse to vote by mail. Automatically sending ballots in the mail to registered voters. It's just sad that you're right, Kim. It's become partisan, where some folks. Look, and I give you credit. You are the exception when I line you up against your Republican colleagues in most parts of the country. You've been embracing a vote by mail and other things, but look at what the experience was in Congress just a couple of weeks ago, trying to advocate for resources in the most recent stimulus package. And there's going to be room for dialogue in the next round, hopefully. But why not couple that with national standards like vote by mail, like online registration, like more access to in-person early voting, because it is good for the health and safety of everybody, helps preserve our democracy during this pandemic. A lot more Democrats were for it. Unfortunately, especially Republican leaders, resistance to it. So, I commend you, Kim, but we got to get that message further up the political ladder here to really open up the resource floodgates and the policy floodgates in the interest of serving everybody.
Good.
No, and I'll just add quickly, I'm unaffiliated, so I'm bringing up the 40-some% of the country, I guess, that has fallen into that. But I agree on the nonpartisan aspect of this. And when you look across the country, certainly, and I'll just, I think the Western states have led on this, and it could be that there's a perspective in the West that we're frontierism and we want to try to sort of push the envelope in terms of innovation. But Western states have led on this, which is not unlike some of the other voting rights issues that we've seen over our country's time, whether it's women's suffrage or other voting rights issues that have come up. A lot of times that innovation and that leadership has happened in Western states. So we certainly want to make sure that we continue to make this a nonpartisan issue, talk about it as an access for all type of model. And that's what I think is really important to keep people focused on, in that we want to make sure everyone can access the system in an accessible and secure and safe way.
Great. Amber, thank you. And let me just close by encouraging those of you who work for a business or lead a business to be in touch with us, because as all the speakers have indicated, there's a lot of work to be done in a relatively short period of time. And the business community, we feel, really has an unprecedented opportunity here to contribute to the solvency of our representative democracy. And I think, companies large and small can help out here. As Kim noted, there's a lot of work to be done. So just as a reminder, it's important, I think, to participate in Time to Vote. So check out maketimetovote.org, contact Business for America about how you can participate in election security. And we hope, Business for America hopes to be working with Amber's group in the coming months to focus on particular states where there may be a greater opportunity to implement a vote-by-mail system. And then last thought is, if this conversation has been stimulating and you're curious, you should give your own Secretary of State a call where you live and ask them what their plan is, because we clearly have heard from Secretary Wyman from Washington and Secretary Padilla from California that they want your help and they'd like to hear from you. So thank you all so much for joining us. We will be organizing additional webinars in the weeks to come, and look forward to working with you all. So stay safe and be healthy, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.